So the question is to me, and wanting to know why I got into films in the first place. It's a very long story. I'll try and make it very short. I grew up in England during the war. My parents were both away. I looked after my grandmother, who was a film buff. They didn't call them film buffs in those days. She used to go to the cinema 4 times a week. And she took me 4 times a week. And it was wonderful because she took me to the most unsuitable films. And so I very quickly got to love that. And then when the war ended, it was very sad for me because my father came back from Burma and my mother stopped doing the voluntary work she was doing. And we resumed a normal life. And normal life meant no movies. And that was terrible. So finally, as soon as I could, I started sort of sneaking out, saying I was going to walk the dog, and I'd take the dog around the corner, tie it onto a tree, and go to a movie. Which got me into a lot of trouble, but got me to see a lot of movies. And from the very beginning, I don't know why, but I made notes about the movies, as Margaret rightly said. And I still have those notes. I refer to them sometimes. I'm quite surprised that some of my very young opinions when I was 9, 10, 11, are not so far off how I feel about some of those films today. So that's how I got into it, and it became a sort of passion. Okay.
Do we ever walk out of a film and still review it? You know, how do we cope with the bad ones?
How do you stop yourself walking out?
No, it's hard, and I mean, people say, oh, you know, you so envy your job, but they forget that, you know, the bulk of the films that you will see in a year are really mediocre. But, I mean, you live for the good ones, and certainly we never walk out. That's not allowed. And in Cannes or in Venice, where, you know, we might have an interview and we've got to walk out in the middle of a fabulous film, it's really frustrating, but we will always bother to go and see the whole film again if we're reviewing it. I've only walked out of one film in recent times, and that was the remake of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And I just couldn't cope with that. And it was in a cinema. And it was like, you know, 4 guys with raincoats sitting around us. No, I'm getting out of here. I hate it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I walked out of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but I was one of the guys with the raincoats probably. It's dispiriting, and it's interesting because so many Hollywood films these days are apparently made for 12-year-olds, if that. And I guess why I'm drawn to the history of cinema, cinema earlier eras, because in those days they were made for grown-ups, as well as children. I mean, it was much more sophisticated industry in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, into the 70s, really. It's the sort of, after about the 80s, the rocks, etc. So and then occasionally you'll see something wonderful, like The Social Network or True Grit, and it'll restore your faith, and you'll keep going again for a bit longer.
And, you know, I mean, independent American cinema is very strong. And, you know, I'm reading it at the moment, and it's so beautifully written. Winter's Bone was a fabulous little film. You know, for me it was one of the best ones of the year. So there are gems that come along that keep you sustained.
And that's what keeps you going. Do you want to get that, or?
No, I'm sure.
Well, obviously, times change, and I'm not sure that we change with them, but times certainly change. This is a time when, as you rightly say, you go to the cinema and you see people texting, extremely annoying habit, so please don't do it when you go to the cinema. Because the people around you are having to see this whole little lighted phones thing. But people do, they're texting their friends, and they'll tell you that some films are doomed after the very first session, or even before the first session's finished, because the word of mouth has got out through texting that this film's no good, so don't bother to go to the next session, go and see something else. It's an interesting time. It's a different time from when I was young, obviously. And another thing that's very different about it is that when I was growing up, when you saw a film, once it finished its cinema release, you'd be very, very lucky to see it again. Because there was no video, obviously, and some things would come on television, but in those days it was black and white television, so you didn't want to see a colour film. So, you know, if you missed the initial release, then that was it. And so you had to have really, hence the notes. That's why I wrote notes. Because you'd see a film like, I don't know how many of you watched that movies this past week, but we were in this new classic section we're doing. I was talking about a film which I absolutely adore called The Night of the Hunter, which I saw in England when I was about 15 or 16. And it was on for 1 week. And I went and saw it twice in that 1 week because I loved it so much the first time. I knew that I would never have a long time. I mean, I thought I would never see it again. And now, of course, you can buy the Blu-ray copy with 2.5 hours of ad tape. And who would have dreamed that that would have happened? So we don't know what technology is coming around the corner, but it changes things all the time.
But to get back to your question, I actually have noticed in the 25 years that we've been doing the show a much greater interest in film from particularly young people. I think there's a great deal of cine literacy in this country amongst young people. I think they take film incredibly seriously. I think that if people are encouraged to put their opinions on the web, I think it's wonderful. I think the more people, it's like having a conversation with a lot of people about film, which is basically pretty much what we do all the time. And I think it's very healthy. And if anything, you can chart this explosion in film interest that's just grown exponentially over the last quarter century. And I think it's really lovely in this country. And the fact that kids can make their own films now with the technology. So it's taught in schools. There's so many possibilities for employment in film.
How do you define critical standards and how do they change and all that sort of thing? I don't know that I go into it quite as formally as that. I respond on a very emotional level too. So does Margaret, I think it's true to say, she can speak for herself. To films. For me, a film's got to start with an interesting idea, an interesting story, which has got to be told in an accessible sort of way, and it's got to engage me emotionally. Once you get all those things, all the elements working together, I think you've got something interesting. Sometimes you get films which have some elements but not others, and they're the ones that you can't rate as highly as the ones that seem to encompass all the others. The Social Network is a film, the only film last year I gave 5 out of 5 to. I'm not particularly fond of the star system, but we have to do it. So the only film I gave 5 out of 5 last year from any source was The Social Network, because I thought it was a film that succeeded on every single level that it was attempting to succeed, in terms of writing, acting, making a really dull subject really interesting. But sometimes you see a film which has a wonderful scene or wonderful performances, but overall it kind of doesn't work. But it's subjective. It doesn't work for me. It's not to say it won't work for you.
Well, I think that's, is there an absolute benchmark for judging cinema? And I don't believe there is. I think that, I think that's pretty much the premise at the movies and the movie show, was that there are a multiplicity of views on what makes a film good.
Well, 2 anyway.
And people come at film in such different ways. And so that David may like a film. You see, I mean, he's talking about The Social Network, but you see, what I loved about it was the screenplay, and the fact is that it's Shakespearean. It takes on those major human dimensions of betrayal and greed and ego. And that's, I'm always looking at the writing more than anything else, I suppose. I like I love well-written films. I love, as you'll see next week, you know, I love great dancing in films. You know, there are certain things that turn all of us on, and we tend to know what we respond to in film. But at the same time, David and I sat there watching Cocoon 2 all those years ago, and I'm telling you, within 30 seconds, you can tell that that director doesn't know what he's doing. And we agreed on that.